Okay, here it is. Kate Chopin. As the day was pleasant, Madame Valmont drove over to La Brie to see Desiree and the baby. It made her laugh to think of Desiree with the baby. Why, it just seemed like yesterday that Desiree was a little more than a baby herself. When Monsieur, in riding through the gateway of Valmont, had found her lying asleep in the shadow of the big stone pillar. The little one awoke in his arms and began to cry for Dada, and that was as much as she could say. Some people thought she might have strayed there of her own accord, for she was of a toddling age. The prevailing belief was that she had been purposely left by a party of Texans whose canvas-covered wagon late in the day had crossed the ferry that Coton Maïf kept just below the plantation. In time, Madame Valmont abandoned every speculation but the one that Desiree had been sent to her by a beneficent providence to be the child of her affection, seeing that she was without child of flesh, for the girl grew to be a beautiful and gentle, affectionate and sincere, the idol of Valmont. It was no wonder when she stood again against the stone pillar in whose shadow she had lain asleep 18 years before, that Armand Aubigné, riding by and seeing her there, had fallen in love with her. That was the way all the Ambigues fell in love, as if struck by a pistol shot. The wonder was that he had not loved her before, for he had known her since her father brought him home from Paris, a boy of 8, after his mother died there. The passion that awoke him in that day when he saw her at the gate swept along like an avalanche, or like a prairie fire, like anything that drives headlong over all obstacles. Monsieur Valmont grew practical and wanted things well considered. That is, the girl's obscure origin. Armand looked into her eyes and did not care. He was reminded that she was nameless. What did it matter about a name when he could give her one of the oldest and proudest in Louisiana? He ordered the corbeille from Paris and contained himself with what patience he could until it arrived, and then they were married. Madame Valmont had not seen Desiree and the baby for 4 weeks. When she reached La Brie, she shuddered at the first sight of it, as she always did. It was a sad-looking place, which for many years had not grown the gentle presence of a mistress. Old Monsieur Aubigné, having married and buried his wife in France, and she having loved her own land too well to ever leave it, the roof came down steep and black like a cowl, reaching out beyond the wide galleries that circled the yellow Secoste house. Big, solemn oaks grew close to it, and their thick-leaved, far-reaching branches swallowed it like a pall. Young Abney's rule was a strict one, too, and under it his niggers had forgotten how to be gay, as they had been during the old master's easygoing and indulgent lifetime. The young mother was recovering slowly and lay full length in her soft white muslins and laces upon a couch. The baby was beside her, upon her arm, where he had fallen asleep at her breast. The yellow nurse woman sat beside a window, fanning herself. Madame Valmont bent her portly figure over Desiree and kissed her, folding her and instantly tenderly in her arms. And then she turned to the child. "This is not the baby," she exclaimed in startled tones. French was the language spoken in Valmont in those days. "I knew you'd be astonished," laughed Desiree, "at the way he has grown. The little cocoon had de lait. Look at his legs, Mama, and his hands and fingernails. Real fingernails. Zandrine had to cut them this morning. Isn't it true, Zandrine?" The woman bowed her turbaned head majestically. "Merci, madame." "And the way she cries," went on Desiree, "is deafening. Armand heard him the other day as far away as La Branche's cabin." Madame Lavande had never removed her eyes from the child. She lifted it and walked it with it over to the window that was the lightest. She scanned the baby narrowly, then looked searchingly at Zandrine, whose face was turned to gaze across the fields. "Yes, the child has grown, has changed," said Madame Valmont slowly as she replaced it beside its mother. What does Armand say? Desiree's face became suffused with a glow that was happiness itself. Oh, Armand is the proudest father in the parish, I believe, chiefly because it is a boy to bear his name through, though he says not that he would have loved a girl as well. But I know it isn't true. I know he said that to please me. And Mama, she added, drawing Madame Valmondi's head down to her and speaking in a whisper, he hasn't punished one of them, not one of them, since the baby was born. Even Negrillon, who pretended to have burnt his leg that he might rest from work, he only laughed and said Negrillon was a great scamp. Oh, Mama, I'm so happy it frightens me. What Desiree said was true. Marriage and later the birth of his son had softened Armand Avogne's imperious and exacting nature greatly. This was what made the gentle Desiree so happy, for she loved him desperately. When he frowned, she trembled, but loved him. When he smiled, she asked no greater blessing of God. But Armand's dark, handsome face had not often been disfigured by frowns since the day he fell in love with her. When the baby was about 3 months old, Desiree awoke one day to the conviction that there was something in the air menacing her peace. It was at first too subtle to grasp. It had only been disquieting suggestion, an air of mystery among the blacks, unexpected visits from far-off neighbors who could hardly account for their coming. Then a strange, an awful change in her husband's manner, which she dared not ask him to explain. When he spoke to her, it was with averted eyes, from which the old love light seemed to have gone out. He absented himself of her child without excuse, and the very spirit of Satan seemed suddenly to take hold of him in his dealings with the slaves. Desiree was miserable enough to die. She sat in her room one hot afternoon in her peignoir, listlessly drawing through the fingers and strands of her long silky brown hair that hung about her shoulders. The baby, half naked, lay asleep on her own gray mahogany bed. It was like a sumptuous throne, with its satin-lined half-canopy. One of the Lebranche's little quadroon boys, half-naked, too, stood fanning the child slowly with a fan of peacock feathers. Desiree's eyes had been fixed absently and sadly upon the baby, while she was striving to penetrate the threatening mist that she felt closing in about her. She looked from the child to the boy, who stood back behind him, and back again over and over. Ah! It was a cry that she could not help, which she was not conscious of having uttered. The blood turned like ice in her veins, and a clamsy moisten gathered upon her face. She tried to speak to the little quadroon boy, but no sound would come. At first, when he heard his name uttered, he looked up, and his mistress was pointing to the door. He had laid aside the great soft fan and obediently stole away over the polished floor on his bare tiptoes. She stayed motionless with gaze riveted upon her child, and her face the picture of fright. Presently her husband entered the room, and without noticing her went to the table and began a search among some papers which covered it. Armand, she called to him in a voice which must have stabbed him if he was human, but he did not notice. Armand, she said again. Then she rose and tottered towards him. Armand, she panted once more, clutching his arm. Look at our child. What does it mean? Tell me. He coldly but gently loosened her fingers from about his arm and thrust the hand away from him. Tell me what it means, she cried despairingly. It means, he answered lightly, that the child is not white. It means that you are not white. A quick conception of all that had accusation meant for her nerved her with unwanted courage to deny it. It is a lie. It is not true. I am white. Look at my hair. It's brown. My eyes are gray, Armand. You know they are gray, and my skin is fair, seizing his wrist. Look at my hand. Whiter than yours, Armand. She laughed hysterically. As white as Leblanche's, he replied brutally, and went away, leaving her alone with her child. When she could not hold a pen in her hand, she sent a despairing letter to Madame Valmondi. My mother, they tell me I am not white. Armand has told me that I am not white. For God's sake, tell him that it is not true. You must know it is not true. I shall die. I must die. I cannot be so unhappy and live. The answer that came was brief. My own Desiree, come home to Valmondi, back to your mother who loves you. Come with your child. When the letter reached Desiree, she went with it to her husband's study and laid it upon the desk before which he sat. She was like a stone image, silent, white, motionless, after she placed it there. In silence, he ran his cold eyes over the written word. He said nothing. Shall I go, Armand? She asked in tones of sharpness and agonized suspense. Yes, go. Do you want me to go? Yes, I want you to go. He thought Almighty God had dealt cruelly and unjustly with him, and felt somehow that he was paying him back in kind when he stabbed thus into his wife's soul. Moreover, he no longer loved her because of the unconscious injury she had brought upon his name and his home. She turned away like one stunned by a blow and walked slowly toward the door, hoping he would call her back. Goodbye, Armand, she moaned. He did not answer her. That was his last blow at fate. Desiree went in search of her child. Zandrine was pacing the sober gallery with it. She took a little one from the nurse's arms and with no word of explanation and descending the steps walked away under the live oak branches. It was an October afternoon. The sun was just sinking. Out of the still fields, the Negroes were picking cotton. Desiree had not changed the thin white garment nor the slippers which she wore. Her hair was uncovered, and the sun's rays brought a golden gleam from its brown meshes. She did not take the broad, beaten road which led to the far-off plantation of Valmondi. She walked across the deserted field where the stubble bruised her tender feet so delicately shod and tore her thin gown to shreds. She disappeared among the reeds and willows that grew thick along the banks of the deep, sluggish bayou, and she did not come back again. Some weeks later, there was a curious scene enacted at La Brie. In the center of the smoothly swept backyard was a great bonfire. Armand Abigny sat in the wide hallway that commanded a view of the spectacle, and it was he who dealt out the half-dozen Negroes the material which was kept the fire ablaze. A graceful cradle of willow, with all its dainty furbishness, was laid upon the pyre, which had already been fed with the richness of the priceless layette, and there were silk gowns and velvet and satin ones added to these, laces too, and embroideries, bonnets, and gloves, for the corbel had been of rare quality. The last thing to go was a tiny bundle of letters, innocent little scribblings that Desiree had sent to him during the days of their espousal. There was a remnant of that one back in the drawer from which he took them. But it was not Desiree's. It was part of an old letter from his mother to his father. He read it. She was thanking God for the blessing of her husband's love. But above all, she wrote, night and day I thank the good God for having so arranged our lives that our dear Armand will never know that his mother, who adores him, belongs to the race that is cursed with the brand of slavery.
Whoa.